Greetings again. I'm again coming to you from the Draper Public Library. I'm going to be lecturing for this video on the material that deals with choice of entity and forms of business organizations. It's a little bit of a shift in gears. We've been concentrating, I think, as you well understand by now, on personnel matters, human resources, and the government regulation of our employer-employee relationships. We also did discuss some of the concepts, tort concepts, which is a civil law concept, already associated with employer-employee relationships, such as respondeat superior. Remember that? That's the doctrine that says that if an employee commits a wrongful act while working within the scope of employment, then the employer is vicariously liable to any third party that was injured by the employee's wrongful act. And we also are going to now begin to understand what business entrepreneurs and business people can do to protect themselves from at least minimize the impact anyway of that type of activity, that type of application of that doctrine to themselves. And of course, one of the ways, as we will find out, will be to form an artificial entity, which we today commonly call the corporation. Now, I will structure this lecture around the form of business charts that you can find on Blackboard. And if you open that up, the lecture and also discussion questions are centered around the discussions that can be structured using this form of business chart. And so with that, that's where we're going to go next. I will try to activate my screen share and hopefully then be able to pull up that form of business chart. Let's see. Yeah, I think I have it here. Now, for our purposes, and I have simplified, I'm trying to simplify things as much as possible here for us to give some basic ideas as to the form of businesses and the consequences of advantages and disadvantages, I guess, of utilizing each form of business. And as I have said, that I'm I am trying to simplify things a bit here. The forms of business that are currently available to entrepreneurs today. Of course, the spectrum is broader than this, but in some way or form or another, they all have can hark back to these three basic types. Okay, and so let's go through them and identify the three basic types. The first and most basic type of form of business organization is what we call the sole proprietorship. And this form of business, it generally takes no actual legal requirement to form a sole proprietorship, other than an individual will form an intention to operate a business for profit. And by the way, that's what we're really concentrating on. I'll mention non-for-profit businesses a little bit later on in the lecture, but for our purposes, we're concentrating on businesses. And the sole proprietorship is created simply by an individual forming an intention to operate a business for profit and then taking an affirmative action, a step to carry out that intention. And it's as simple as that to form and would legally be recognized as a sole proprietorship as a business. Um, it's very simple to do. For instance, your daughter decides she needs a new iPhone 10R, right? and of course, when she discusses it with you as her parent, you point out to her the expense, and if she wants a new iPhone 10, that she must contribute to the cost of obtaining and paying bills for such a phone. And as a result, she gets the bright idea that she is going to go out to the corner, and she makes up a sign that says lemonade for sale. She goes out to the corner and she gets some instant lemonade and some paper cups and sits out there and sells glasses of lemonades to her friends in order to raise money. Has your daughter now, from a legal point of view, is she now the operator of a sole proprietorship? Yes. Yes, she has. She is. And so, very simple to create one, and even hobbies can be considered at times to be sole proprietorships. It doesn't have to be full time. Part-time things that do just fine. Now, one of the aspects, and this is key to understanding sole proprietorships and corporations, that is artificial entities, and the differences, is that the owner of the business, the sole proprietor, and an example I give you would be your daughter, the owner of that business and the business are one in the same. And it's essentially a sole proprietorship, and the owner, they have a legal identity. And there's some consequences to that idea, which we need to be aware of. And a couple of them are, and this idea of who is responsible for the debts and obligation of sole proprietorship. And I guess the best way, if you're a control freak, sole proprietorships are your thing, because you have complete and total control of the sole proprietorship as the owner. You don't share it with anyone, which means that you get all the glory, i.e. all the profits, but also if things don't go so well, and the business loses money, guess what? You're solely responsible as the owner, as the sole proprietor, for those losses. And so if you borrow money as a sole proprietor and the business loses money, guess what? You're responsible for paying the debt, even though the business no longer would exist. And so we say that one of the disadvantages of operating as a sole proprietor is this idea that the owner of the business has unlimited personal liability for the debts and obligations of the sole proprietorship. And so let's suppose that let's make this, expand this a little bit, but we talked about this previously. Suppose that you're operating a baked goods business, and you have expanded, and you are marketing your baked goods to retail outlets in the region. You hire a delivery driver, and you buy a delivery truck. And of course, you tell the delivery driver what to do, when to do it, how to do it. With regard to the delivery of the baked goods, you even instruct him not to take his phone along, right? And stay off the phone while he's operating the vehicle. But of course, what happens? He disobeys your instructions, goes ahead and takes the phone, is using the phone, and hits a little old lady in the crosswalk while on the delivery route. We already understand by the doctrine of respondeat superior that the employer, that is the sole proprietorship in the example we're talking about here, is liable for the employee's negligent action, right? Even though you instructed not to use the phone, because it's vicarious liability, you still are what? On the hook for the damages caused by the delivery driver to the little old lady, which could be substantial. Now, if you're operating that baked goods company as a sole proprietor, guess what? When you are found along with your delivery driver to be liable to the little old lady that was hit, and jury awards the little old lady $3 million. Guess what? Can they reach you, sole proprietor's personal assets? Yes, including your home and any other personal assets you may possess. And generally, the only refuge you have at that point in time, if you do not have enough insurance, would be personal bankruptcy. Ooh, not a good outcome. So clearly, one of the disadvantages of this form of business is this idea of unlimited personal liability, and it kind of evolves from the idea that the business owner and the business are one and the same. They're from a legal point of view. There's another consequence here that comes directly from the idea that when you are operating a sole proprietorship, that the business and the owner, the individual, are one and the same, and that has to do with duration. Obviously, an owner, an individual, can form and operate and then cease to operate a business more or less at will. I mean, as long as you pay your debts, the business can cease to exist as long as you pay taxes on the profits you earned, remember, and then that you can form businesses, operate them, and then collapse them. And you can do that fairly simple and fairly easily, actually, as long as you observe the requirements of the law with regard to paying taxes on the profits and things like that nature, and paying the debts. However, what happens if the owner, the sole proprietor, becomes disabled and no longer is physically and or mentally able to operate the business, or the owner actually passes away while the business is operating? What happens to the business at that point? Since the law says that since the owner and the business are one and the same, the business ceases to operate. Now, from a legal point of view, what happens then is the business goes into a mode of winding up any current transactions that may be pending, liquidating the assets, and then generally distributing those assets to the owner's heirs at law, that is, children or wife or relatives or whoever the individual, if they died with a will, left their assets to. And it happens automatically now. Suppose that there are children and they are part of the business, they want to carry on the business, can they do so? Yes, if they can reach an agreement among themselves. They can do that, choose to carry it on, but we, as from a legal point of view, even though the name may be the same, even though essentially it may be the same type of business, and it may be being operated idea of the owner of a sole proprietorship is one and the same in business. The idea that it ceases to exist as a legal entity, as a recognized legal entity, once then the owner dies. Now, let's kind of talk about partnerships in kind of the same light here. And partnerships are very much like sole proprietorships, except for one aspect, and that instead of having one owner's partners, ships have multiple owners, and generally most states have passed a partnership statute, which in the absence of an agreement govern how partnerships are operated. And I think essentially partnerships are an agreement between two or more individuals, and current partnership law allows artificial entities, corporations, by the way, define partnerships. That's often done in the construction industry, where construction companies will form joint agreements to carry out a certain development and construction project. But essentially, then a partnership can be created by two or more individuals and or entities to carry on a profitable business. I know this says that it's a separate legal entity, that a partnership generally is recognized as a separate legal entity. That's a little bit misleading. While, for instance, in Illinois, the partnership statute says that partnerships can sue and be sued in their name. They really aren't recognized per se, as the partnership is not recognized as being separate and apart from the owners, that is, the partners. That's the key thing partnerships and sole proprietorships have in common. That is that the partners and the partnership are one and the same. And the consequence of that, just like sole proprietorship, is that the partners again have unlimited personal liability for the debts and obligations of the partnership. And there is no shield that partners can legally have that protects them, protects their personal assets from the debts and obligations of the partnership. And one of the things partnerships can have employees, and we understand vicarious liability respondeat superior for employees, and so the partners can have unlimited personal liability for the wrongful conduct of their employees. But guess what? Yeah, can you have unlimited personal liability for the wrongful actions of your partners too? And the answer to that, of course, is yes. And so, to the extent that I think one of the big drawbacks, and I have practiced with partners previously in the law practice, and that is always an issue that you have to be aware of when you have partners in a legal firm, that you are responsible for the wrongful or negligent act of those partners should they damage the client. And so it's always important, triple important, to make sure that a partnership has sufficient insurance resources to protect the other partners in the event that one partner commits a wrongful act, and as a result, the partnership finds itself liable. And of course, that also applies to employees. Also, termination of the partnership agreement is kind of the same way. Remember, in a sole proprietorship, you can stop the business at will, more or less, as long as you do the winding up appropriately. And you can do the same thing with partnerships. Partnerships agreements very often will have termination provisions on what has to happen to terminate the partnership, and the winding up phases, how that is to be accomplished. And so a partner always has the legal ability to withdraw from a partnership agreement, although you have to be aware, if you breach the agreement by not following the termination procedure set out either in the agreement or the statute, you could find yourself liable for any damages your partners would perhaps suffer as a result of a wrongful termination. But generally, you do have the right to do that at any time. And again, like sole proprietorships, should a partner become disabled or die, then the partnership is terminated automatically upon the death or disability of one of the partners. And the partnership goes into a winding up phase. Again, if the business, the partnership business is to be continued, it's going to be continued as a new business, because obviously one of the partners, anytime one of the partners, that is one of the owners, changes in the partnership, it becomes a new business. Now, let's kind of understand now two of the major limitations, disadvantages, perhaps you may want to say, of sole proprietorships and partnerships, which is this idea of unlimited personal liability for the death and obligation of the business, and the idea that the duration of the business is directly tied and connected to the health and lifespan of the owners. Okay, and those consequences all kind of, again, if you think about it, arise out of the idea that the owners of the business of a sole proprietorship and partnership are one and the same as the business. Okay. Now, let's then contrast that with a corporation. And corporations, let's make no mistake, are artificial entities. And that absent an act of a state legislature, which has been signed by a governor and adopted by a state, that absent that act, then corporations cannot exist. In other words, they are creatures of statute. They are creatures of law. Sole proprietorships and partnerships have been recognized as forms of business, legal forms of business, going back forever. Corporations are a relatively new phenomenon. Again, they were created to address some of the problems that we've already discussed with sole proprietorships and partnerships. And actually, quite frankly, corporations, that is artificial business entities, if you look at the history of them, they were actually created in the post-Columbian War, that is era, that is after Columbus, quote unquote, discovered the New World. And the whole idea of a corporation was to allow the monarchs of Europe, Britain, France, Netherlands, Spain, on and on and on, to exploit the people and resources of the quote New World. And the reason for their shall we say, and even the terminology that we use with corporations goes back to that founding. That Europe and the monarchs in Europe had been involved in costly and bloody family wars. These monarchs were all closely related, and for some reason they insisted for hundreds of years of engaging in warfare among themselves. And of course, as everyone understands, warfare is expensive, and you can't be able to wage war on your neighbor. You got to have what? Gold, cash, somehow or another. And one of the real reasons why Spain sponsored Columbus's voyages, the idea was to get to China to open up trade routes, to give the Spanish monarchy access to revenues from trade with China that they didn't have previously, which again allowed them to pay their mercenary armies and the costs of waging war on France and the Netherlands and England, right? Yeah, and that's what it was all about. They were broke, right? Now remember that the monarchs were broke from all their wage warring, so they did not themselves have the cash, that is the gold and people available to exploit Columbus's discovery. They didn't. It takes to launch those expeditions to exploit peoples and resources in North America. It took money, and they didn't have money. So what they came up with, obviously, Columbus claimed the New World, North America, and the Spanish monarch's name, and the same thing essentially happened with all the other monarchs in Europe. And once these lands had been claimed, they then wanted to figure out how to exploit these things, that is to colonialize North America. And the corporation, the artificial entity, essentially what this was about, and essentially the Hudson Bay Company, and there were numerous other privately chartered companies, shall we say, that were chartered by the monarchs and given the exclusive right to exploit the resources and peoples of the New World in the name of the monarch. And essentially what it was is these artificial entities, these corporations, would receive a charter from the monarch, allowing them to, again, the exclusive right to exploit the resources and peoples of the New World. In exchange, they would give monarchs a cut of the profits. The owners of the charters would have to come up with the funds, and they did. They were able to raise capital to exploit the resources. And one of the keys to being able to raise capital, once having received a charter from the operators of the business, was the idea that the individuals providing the capital for these expeditions and attempts to exploit the resources would contribute the capital, get a cut of the profits. But if the venture went belly up, which some of them did, the first Jamestown expedition went belly up, it was a total failure, that the backers, that is, the people that provided capital for the expedition, would not have personal liability for the failure. In other words, nobody could come back to them and say, you're responsible for the failure, you did this wrong, you did this wrong. That they would lose their investment, but they would not have or bear any personal responsibility or the failure of the expedition. expedition, because these were quite risky. And investors, as today, were willing to risk their investment, but they wanted assurances that was, if things went belly up, that the limit of their responsibility was going to be their investment. And so the idea of the charter corporation then came into existence. And the Dutch, the English, the French, the Spanish, the Portuguese all employed this idea of the monarchs issuing charters to a group of individuals who would be responsible for carrying out the expedition, and they would enlist the help of investors to fund the expedition, with the key understanding being that the investors would have their capital at risk, but would not be responsible personally for the success or failure. Now, of course, if the venture was a success, and eventually many of them were successes, then guess who would share in the profits? Yeah, the Crown obviously got the biggest share. The operators of the venture got a share, and then the folks that put up the capital also got a share. Okay, so that's how the idea of the corporation existed. And remember, the understanding it was created by who? The Crown, monarchs, by law. And so these forms of business organizations, as we see them today, have their history, direct history that traces to us. And in the United States, generally formation and operation of corporations, as we are discussing them, is governed by state law. And so all 50 states have passed some version of what we call the Model Business Corporation Act, which sets down the rules of how corporations are to be formed, operated, and also terminated. And one of the things we are going to talk about and make sure we have to make sure we understand is the idea that these corporations must be operated by the rules. And what we're going to find out is that if you don't strictly follow the rules of the state in which you are operating in, whether it being as a domestic corporation, what we call a domestic, or a foreign corporation, that you must do what? Strictly follow the corporate rules. And one of the consequences we're going to find out, if you don't strictly operate the rules, you may not be considered a corporation. You may actually revert to something akin to a partnership or a sole proprietorship if you don't do what? Follow the statute of the state in which you're operating closely. And it's very close to now, how is a corporation? Generally, the Model Business Corporation Act will, in a state, will generally have the Secretary of State's office in Illinois. The Secretary of State's office, Jesse White, they are the nominated and deemed to be the official keeper of records for corporations. I would urge you, if you're interested at all in entrepreneurship, to get on that site and kind of just explore it a little bit, because it will give you some insight into what is necessary to at least form a corporation. Now, generally, the first step in forming a corporation is you have to file the appropriate paperwork with the Secretary of State's office and pay the appropriate fees. That can be done online. It's a fairly simple, straightforward process, easy to do, I believe. It's not all that difficult. And if you do it properly, then you will receive what they call a certificate of good standing from the Secretary of State's office. Now, essentially what this means is that you will have filed the appropriate paperwork, and paid the appropriate fees, and now you can be recognized as forming a corporation, an artificial entity. Now, again, let me make sure you understand is that to be able to claim corporate status requires quite a bit more than just filing the appropriate paperwork with the Secretary of State's office and paying the fees as we see. You must actually operate the business as a corporation, which is substantially different than the way the owners of a sole proprietorship or partnership can operate their business. And it's key. The particular advantage, I think, as we've already kind of observed, is that the owners of the corporation, and we call the owners of a corporation the shareholders, those owners are separate, deemed to be legally separate and apart from the corporation. In other words, unlike sole proprietorships and partnerships, this artificial entity called a corporation is recognized as a separate legal entity, separate and apart from their owners, who are the shareholders. Okay, that's an important key concept to understand. That the owners of the corporation, that is the shareholders, are separate and apart from the entity itself. Now, an important corollary of this idea that this artificial entity, the business, is that it is separate and apart from the owners, the shareholders, is the idea that unlike sole proprietorship and partnership, if a corporation is appropriately organized, recognized by the state, and run as a corporation, then shareholders do not have unlimited personal liability for the debts and obligations of the business, that is the corporation. They have some liability. It's what we call limited liability. In other words, they can lose their investment. They can lose their stake in the corporation. But in the event the assets of the corporation are insufficient to cover the debts and obligations of the corporation, the creditors of the corporation cannot seek payment from the personal assets of the shareholders. Okay? Yeah, important distinction. So let's make sure we understand the consequence of that, and just go back to our bakery goods example and our delivery driver. Suppose that our owner, when he decided to expand, got the legal advice to form a corporation to operate the business. The former sole proprietor became the sole shareholder of the corporation, and that the business was formed as a corporation. That is, he paid his fees, did the appropriate paperwork. He operated it as a corporation, that is, have regularly shareholders meeting, regular board of directors meetings. We'll talk about what that requires momentarily. And appropriate corporate records, which is key, and operated as a corporation. Ben is the delivery driver, diverts his attention from the roadway by using the smartphone, hits the little old lady, and the little old lady is badly injured. we know previously, right? Under respondeat superior, the driver is liable, so is the employer. The employer here, of course, it would be who? Yeah, the corporation. Billy's Baked Goods Inc., right? And then at that point in time, the little old lady and her attorney, being a creditor of the corporation, can seek to levy their losses against the corporate assets, whatever they may be. Maybe some stale baked goods, the old truck that's got blood all over it now, right? Yeah, and because you were operating the business, and maybe some insurance, but you were operating the business out of rented place. The ovens were rented, blah 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 blah, and so corporation has very little, if any, asset. And the little old lady, even though the corporation has no assets, seek to get the personal assets of the owner of the baked goods, the sole shareholder. And the answer to that is no. That the idea is the sole shareholder will lose their investment, whatever that may be in the corporation currently. And at that point, the liability of the shareholder, assuming they've done things appropriately, ends. And so that's a big advantage, right? Yeah, it is. And so corporations are given this advantage of limited liability for the debts and obligations of the business, whereas sole proprietorships and partnerships are not. Big advantage. An even bigger one, I think, that's very often overlooked is the whole idea of what happens. You have a shareholder or shareholders of a corporation that become disabled or pass, die. What happens to the corporation at that point? And the answer is nothing. And that's one of the big differences. We know if it's sole proprietorship or partnership, and that happens to the owners, the business goes kapooey, right? But with corporations, they keep on ticking by taking the licking. In other words, the shareholders' interest in the corporation simply passes on to their heirs, but the corporation, being an artificial entity with an existence separate and apart from the shareholders, just keeps right on going. And in today's world, we have many multi national or national corporations whose existence goes back hundreds and hundreds of years. I believe the Bank of America, which was originally known as the Bank of Italy, has a corporate existence that can be traced back nearly 400 years. GE, General Electric. General Electric was originally founded in the 1880s by Thomas Edison, and he formed General Electric as a way of exploiting his recent invention of the electric light bulb, and getting the invention of the electric light bulb and generating stations into commercial practice, generally using a 12-volt system, which is entirely different from what we did today. And in fact, it was Westinghouse Corporation that eventually came up with the electrical grid, the idea of the electrical grid as we know it today. And I believe it was Mr. Tesla, I think, his idea was originally to come up with a 110-volt system to power the current grid. But that corporation was formed in 1880, and quite thank you, is doing just frankly just fine today. In this idea, and that corporations can now have a perpetual existence. In other words, and the closest things we have come to godlike creatures quite frankly, because they can have this perpetual interest. It should not surprise us entirely that as we look at the corporate behemoths of today, that they have been able to acquire the assets and wealth and the power influence that comes with that money. Because they, I almost, even a blind hog can find an acorn every so often, and so these they are able over time to amass huge amounts of assets and wealth, and contrast that with sole proprietorships and partnerships. What happens to that wealth generally? If the business is terminated by death or dissolution, and that what happens is that wealth gets dispersed among the owners and the owner's heirs, and so that does not happen with a corporation that has this perpetual existence, and what's far more common for corporations when they end, it's not to be dissolved or terminated because of failure, but generally, it does happen, especially I think with small businesses. But when if you have any success whatsoever as a corporation, generally, what happens? And we see this as I think I've already mentioned this as a business in corporate America today. What happens? As you get bought out, right, or merged or consolidated into another organization, and so the corporation just keeps going on and on and on, and you see that today. I have friends of mine in Chicago that do merger and acquisition business, and going great guns since 2008, and it's real simple to understand. If you've been aware of the markets and stock reports and reading. If you read the corporate statements for many corporations, they have been washing cash, and we've heard the constant criticism. Well, why aren't you creating jobs? You got cash. What are you doing with the cash? Well, what a corporation's been doing with the cash since 2008. They've been buying other corporations, and we have seen further and further concentrations of power and wealth by these corporations consolidating and merging and acquiring each other, and I think that's all part of the perpetual existence thing. And don't ever underestimate the idea that and the advantage over individuals that this idea of perpetual existence gives to corporations. Let me pause here for a minute. Let's just kind of backtrack for a second here, and I want to make sure we all understand the corporate structure as it has generally been provided for in the Model Business Corporation Acts that the states have provided. And I've already mentioned this, the owners of a corporation generally are called shareholders. One of the things we need to understand, shareholders have advantages as the owners of the corporation, of the business, the proprietors and partners. We've already discussed that. It's this idea of limited personal liability for the debts and obligation of the business. But according to the Model Business Corporation Act, shareholders give something up in return for this idea of limited personal liability. And I've already mentioned this. What do they give up? And it's the ability to directly control the operation of the business. I've already said, if you're a control freak, sole proprietorship is your thing, because you've got complete, total, and direct control of the business. But you also have what? You also have all the personal liability and responsibility for the business. So that's the bad part of it. In return for limited liability, a shareholder has given up and must give up direct and complete, not direct and complete, but direct control of the day-to-day operations of the corporation. Now, as the owner of the corporation, what right do you have as a shareholder? And that's essentially one, and that's to vote. There are some things that are provided, will be provided in what we call the bylaws, and also in the statute, that shareholders get to vote on. And it's fairly limited, frankly. The first thing and most important thing you get to do is to vote to elect a board of directors. Board of directors can be officers, and they can be shareholders. They can be what we call outside directors, which have they're neither officers nor employees of the corporation, nor shareholders. So, but shareholders get to vote and elect the directors of the corporation. That's and very often the Model Business Corporational Act will say that there has to be a minimum of 3 directors that a shareholder will elect. The shareholders will elect, and the idea being is that the shareholders elect directors, and they empower and authorize then the directors to make the overall decisions about how the corporation, the business, is going to be operated, who the officers are going to be, and who the key employees are going to be. And essentially, where is all the control of the operation of the business vested? It's vested in the board of directors. Okay? And so shareholders give up direct control. An illustration of this is that profits of business of a corporation, when those are returned to shareholders, we call those dividends. Dividends. And so if a corporation is going to return profits of the business to the shareholders, that authority is vested solely not in the shareholders, but here, the board of directors. An example of this would be Apple, who was immensely profitable, is an immensely profitable and cash-rich cow. And while Steve Jobs was alive and he controlled the board and controlled Apple, Apple never did pay a dividend. That is, they never did return any profits directly to the shareholders from the operation of the business. The idea that Jobs has was, we're going to reinvest all our profits into development and personnel, and getting the top people, right, and to make the business grow. Shareholders had to be content with making money on Apple, and they did, of course, by buying low when Apple was not such a behemoth. And then as the stock price rose and appreciated, then they could sell their shares for profit, right, generally for a long-term capital gain. While Steve Jobs was still alive, a corporate raider by the name of Carl Icahn, and he has a rich and colorful history as a corporate raider, as a cannibalistic capitalist, I guess he can be called. He was responsible for the demise of TWA in the St. Louis area, of course. But Icahn, while Jobs was still alive, became a minority shareholder, a significant minority shareholder of Apple, and had many disputes with Jobs about whether or not Apple was to issue dividends, that is, pay some profits, take some of that cash they had on hand, and return it to the shareholders. Steve Jobs resisted that. He controlled enough shares of stock to control the board of directors. And while Icahn at every shareholder meeting and every opportunity he get would try to introduce resolutions requiring Apple to pay dividends, they were always deemed to be out of order because only the board of directors had the power to declare a dividend in order for the company to pay dividends. That did not occur while Jobs was alive. Jobs was able to maintain control of the board of directors. However, after Jobs passed away and his shares, his influence on the board was diluted, then Icahn was able to get a board of directors elected. And as soon as that new board of directors came in, they began to have Apple pay dividends. And so as much as the shareholder, our Carl Icahn, or other shareholders may have wanted Apple to pay a dividend, they could not control that directly. They could only influence that through what? Voting to get a board of directors elected at a shareholders meeting that would then have a board of directors meeting and then declare a dividend. And so clearly then shareholders give up direct control, don't they, of the business? Yeah. And I know some of you that are interested in entrepreneurship will say, well, what about closely held businesses where you have one shareholder? Let's do our delivery, our baked goods company, and the founder of the baked good company incorporates. There's a single shareholder, him, but the Metal Business Corporation Act requires that there be 3 directors, and so he appoints himself as a director, and then has maybe his wife and his brother, who may or may not be directly interested in operating the business, but he as a shareholder elects those 3. Now, obviously, the business decisions for that Billy's Baked Goods Inc. now, I as the sole proprietorship, that's my sole shareholder, excuse me, I now must have board of directors meetings, and if I want to declare a dividend, that is, if I want to take cash out of my business, what do I have to do? And I, as a shareholder, simply write a check, and maybe I can elect myself as president, right? And let's suppose that occurs. That we have a board of directors meeting, myself, my wife, and my brother, and they elect me as president and CEO of the corporation, and say that my brother's the treasurer, and suppose that I want to pay myself a dividend. What do I have to do as the sole shareholder? I have to have a board of directors meeting. I have to introduce a resolution indicating that so much money is going to be paid as a dividend to me as a shareholder from the corporate bank accounts. And guess what? I got to get 2 out of 3 votes for that resolution to pass. If my brother and my wife want to sabotage my plan to withdraw cash from the corporation as a dividend, can they stop me from doing that? Yes. Now, do I have a remedy as a sole shareholder? Yeah, you better believe it. As soon as the next shareholders meeting is held, I'm going to elect a new board of directors that will be more amenable to my request for a dividend, right? Yeah. But again, you see, it is still, you still have to do what? follow the corporate formalities and make sure everybody understands that even in closely held corporations where we only have one shareholder, and that single shareholder can be the chairman of the board and the president, do we still have to have shareholders meetings? Yeah, or stockholders meeting, or shareholders meetings, yes. But do we have to have board of directors meetings? Yes. And do we have to get at least 3 members of the board of directors to pass on any resolution authorizing any corporate action? The answer to that is yes. And so that's an important thing to understand, is that if you want the protections that the corporate arm of business provides to you, you must recognize this Faustian bargain, the bargain with the devil, so to speak, is that you may be the sole shareholder, and you may be the CEO and president, and you may be chairman of the board, but you cannot do anything without having a board of directors meeting, and getting the appropriate votes from your board of directors to have a true corporate authorization, a true corporate action. And by the way, you need a secretary, and I assume that'll be your wife, to maintain the corporate records. Because if there are no corporate records that memorialize actions such as declarations of dividends, or certain transactions, contracts, leases, sales, purchases, things like that, hiring of key employees by the board of directors. That doesn't happen. It doesn't exist. And we'll even see when we get to Buffalo Creek that one of the key issues at Buffalo Creek was this idea of corporate ownership, and whether Pittston and Buffalo Creek, which were 2 corporate entities, whether or not they were being operated under a single umbrella, or as a wholly owned subsidiary. And we will find out as you read Buffalo Creek that Pittston acquired Buffalo Creek, that corporation. And the question arises, was Buffalo Creek a division of Pittston? And if it was, it would be all under one corporate umbrella. They would be one and the same. And Pittston could find itself as a corporation liable for the actions of its division. Or was Buffalo Creek a wholly owned subsidiary of Pittston? And whether or not there could be a corporate veil between Pittston and Buffalo Creek. And as you will see, the question will boil down to, when you read Buffalo Creek, is whether or not Buffalo Creek, after Pittston became the sole shareholder, was then operated as a corporation or a separate corporation, where Buffalo Creek had a board of directors which held meetings, which made decisions on how Buffalo Creek was to operate it, or did Pittston and the Pittston executives simply take it upon themselves to make those decisions without following the Buffalo Creek corporate formalities? And we will see that while there was some initial confusion, shall we say, about whether or not Buffalo Creek had ever held board of director meetings and whether there ever minutes of those meetings, eventually Pittston admitted that there never was well, I think they said that there were meetings, but there were no records. And if there are no records of Buffalo Creek board of directors, for Buffalo Creek having board of directors meetings and authorizing corporate actions for Buffalo Creek, then it didn't occur. No records, no evidence of the meetings. They didn't occur. So we need to focus in and make sure you understand that operating in the corporate form of business requires more than just filing document with the Secretary of State's office and paying the fees, that well, you may have that certificate that says you were a corporation in good standing. Guess what? That's not the end of the inquiry. The question then becomes is, well, okay, did you actually operate it as a corporation? Did shareholders have meetings with the elected board of directors, and did the board of directors actually have meetings which are documented with corporate records where they actually voted to carry out corporate actions? We will find that when shareholders tend to ignore or tend not to follow corporate procedures, they can find themselves in pretty deep legal problems pretty quickly. And so that is a, let's just say, a trap for the unwary that would attempt to use the advantages of corporate existence without following the formalities. And that is something that can happen quite quickly. Let's go back to Billy's Baked Goods, Inc. to try and see if we can illustrate how quickly this can occur. I've been operating Billy's Baked Good Inc. now for a number of years. We initially, as recommended by our attorneys and accountants, had periodic shareholders meetings where I elected my board of directors, again, my wife and my brother. We did that for a number of years. But after a while, it became tiresome, cumbersome, big pain. So we ceased doing it. And I've actually had students that have been involved in family businesses raise their hands and say, well, we operate in a corporate business, and my dad hasn't had shareholders meeting, board of directors meetings, blah, 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 blah. We don't do any of this stuff. We never had any problems. Well, guess what? It's simply because you've been fortunate and lucky. Because and here how it will go, that I quit having board of directors meetings. I started to take money out of the corporate checkbook directly without authorization from the board of directors. I ran a little short on money, and I needed tuition money for the kids' tuition, Christmas presents, and I began just to take money out of the corporate checkbook. I was a co-signature on it. It wasn't anything. I wasn't stealing money. It was, it's corporation money, but I was using it for personal purposes without following the corporate formalities. That is, having a board of directors meeting, having my wife and brother sign off on the resolution authorizing me to take money out of the business. And we did that, and a couple other things. We maybe did some transactions. I just went ahead and did some transactions without approval of the board of directors, either prospectively or retroactively. And there were no consequences. We completed the contracts. It was no big deal. But then what happens? Yeah, our delivery driver hits the little old lady in the crosswalk, and you guys going to photobomb me? We hit the little old lady in the crosswalk, and of course, you get sued, the delivery driver, and Billy's sued. Delivery drivers found liable were automatically, Billy's Baked Goods Inc. automatically liable under net superior. We know that. But you say, ha-ha, and you waive your corporate charter in the attorney's face for the little old lady and say, yeah, here, you can take the muddy van and some stale baked goods, but you can't reach personal assets because I've been operating as a corporation. Well, what do you think if that lawyer for the little old lady is doing his due diligence? What do you think I'm going to ask for? Am I going to take your word that, yeah, you have that corporate charter, but I'm going to want to know what? Whether you've actually been following the rules, whether you have corporate records that indicate that you've been doing the appropriate thing, which would allow you to claim your corporate status. And so I will begin then to subpoena corporate records, corporate checkbooks. I will ask for minutes of board of directors meetings, shareholders meetings. I will begin to look for the fact you've actually been following the corporate formalities in the way you've been operating your corporation. But guess what? I find that after the first few years of doing what you're supposed to do, you quit doing it, right? And that you've been taking and carrying out the decisions as you, as the sole shareholder, the CEO and the chairman of the board have been operating it not like a corporation going through a board of directors for the operation. What have you been operating it like? Huh? Yeah, it's a sole proprietorship, right? You've taken total and complete control as the sole shareholder. You've been doing things without following the corporate formalities. Yeah. And does it really look like a corporation in the factual way you've been operating it? No. What's it really look like? Yeah, it looks like a sole proprietorship. And because what do we know about sole proprietorships? If you are found to be a sole proprietor and lose your corporate status, what do we know as a sole proprietorship? You have unlimited personal liability for the debts and obligations of the business as a sole proprietorship. Since you chose to operate it not as a corporation, but as a sole proprietor, guess what? We're going to treat you like a what? Sole proprietor. And so in that instance, you would have I as the attorney, or the attorney for the little old lady, is going to have a pretty good shot at what we call piercing the corporate veil, buzzword or bud phrase, I guess, buzz phrase, piercing the corporate veil and reaching the personal assets of the sole shareholder. And that happens quite often, quite frankly. You see that type of thing occurring, yeah, and you can get away with it for a while. It may not catch up with you, but if you get the right set of circumstances going the other way against you, as an entrepreneur or business person, can you find your corporate status in jeopardy? And the answer is yes. So you have to be aware of that. Okay, so let's kind of tie this up a little bit real quick here with regard to piercing the corporate veil. Again, that's the buzz phrase that you need to understand associated with this. And the discussion questions are: you were given an advantage, right? Operating in the corporate form of business. This idea that a shareholder has limited liability for the debts and obligation of the corporation. What have you given up? You have given up direct control. Okay, that's the bargain. But if you want protections of corporate liability, limited liability, you have to give up complete direct control, and you have to use board of directors. And board of directors meetings have to be held. You have to follow those corporate formalities. That protection can be forfeited if you fail to follow those formalities. If the way you operate the business looks more like a sole proprietorship or a partnership, guess what? We're going to treat you that way. And only if that you actually follow the corporate structure that you get the advantages that are given to you by statute. Strict compliance with statute is absolutely necessary. Let's do a hypo here. This is a hypo that's part of, and you can find it in the particular unit, it's Cheeseman on corporate governance. And if you scroll down a ways to 3710, you see piercing corporate veil. I would suggest for the last exam here that you understand the let me make sure I'm recording here. Am I recording? I hope so. Okay, what did I do? No, I'm recording. Okay. It says I'm recording. I was afraid I had paused it. I apologize. Let me go back to my screen share. Yeah. Okay. Piercing the corporate veil. Let me minimize this, please. Okay, thank you. Piercing the corporate veil. This is fairly common in what we see. Waters is the majority shareholder of what we're calling closely held corporations. That's generally, there's, if I recall, 5 or fewer shareholders. And is primarily one of the primary corporations is Wild Horn Ranch Inc. And all of these businesses were run out of Waters' home in Rocky Ford, Colorado. I assume is a different location. Now, Wild Horn operated a resort called Wild Horn Ranch in Teller County. And although Waters claimed the ranch was owned by the corporation, the deed for the property listed Waters as the owners. While he probably did maintain the appropriate records with the Secretary of State's office, that is, that he paid fees, and I'm sure that he was given annual certificates of corporations in good standing. He did little else. He did not, while he said he had corporate meetings at his home, he never took minutes, and he very often paid the one corporation out of the assets of another, and had no documentation that a board of directors of either of the corporations had authorized that type of a transaction. So essentially, he's playing fast and loose with the corporate share game. He's making it seem like he is operating in the corporate businesses in the corporate form, but he's not following the rules. Then what happens? Two guests at one of the resorts drowned while operating a paddleboat. The family of the deceased guests sued for damages under probably some sort of negligence theory, negligent supervision, negligent maintenance, that type of a theory of the property. The question becomes, can Waters be held personally liable? Of course, Waters is going to do what? Hold up the charters and say, yeah, you can take whatever assets are in these corporations, which I doubt are any, but you can't use your personal assets. And of course, the first thing the attorneys for the family are going to ask for records of board of directors meetings authorizing transactions between the corporations as we have here, and of course there are no records. And so that's a big problem. If there are no records, then as far as legally, none of these meetings ever occurred as required by the Model Business Corporation Act. There were some simple things that could have been done here to kind of create and preserve the corporate veil. One of the first things, he didn't have to actually transfer the property that he owned and where the resort was being operated from himself. Couldn't he just have simply executed a lease as the owner of the property, leased it to the corporation, had the corporation pay him a minimal amount of fee or perhaps a percentage of profits as rent, and had that then proved by the corporation that would have been operating the leasehold, and yes, that would have kept those sectors completely separate. That would have been the first step, and then simply having minutes meetings to declare a dividend or a capital transfer between the corporations. That type of stuff, very simple, very easy, doesn't take long to do, but it is what is necessary to preserve the corporate veil. He was actually operating these businesses like a sole proprietorship. Right? Yeah. And so the courts in this instance said that, okay, if you're going to ignore the corporate formalities, if you're going to operate the business like a sole proprietorship, that is exercising direct control over business transactions without going through a board of directors, then you're operating it like a sole proprietorship. We're going to treat you like a sole proprietorship. And therefore, guess what? The owner of the sole proprietorship, Mr. Waters, then has what? Unlimited personal liability for the debts and obligations of the business, and therefore has unlimited personal liability to the guests of Wildhorn Ranch Resort. I guess before the fall go arrogance, and very often that's what this is that I'll never get caught, I'm smarter than that, blah, 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 blah. They'll never see through my subterfuges. Well, guess what? That's what fellas like me get paid for. We take that type of stuff as personal challenges. So, yeah, let's let me see now. Let me stop that share. Okay, you see me again? Yeah. I have just a couple more things to discuss, and we'll be done with this. Let's talk about taxes just very quickly. This is a fairly simple and straightforward subject. Let me go back to my pharma business chart here. Let's see if I can get that up. Minimize that. There, go. Taxation. This is fairly straightforward. We already know that sole proprietorships, the business is one and the same with the owner. Same thing for partners. If you're a sole proprietor, you actually, essentially, all the profits and losses are yours. And profits and losses of a sole proprietorship therefore appear on the individual's tax return. We actually file a Schedule C, which is profit and loss from the business, and show any income, profit from or loss from the business then flow directly to the sole proprietor's individual tax return. Same thing for partners, except the partners get a pro rata share, that is a percentage according to the partnership agreement of the profits and or losses as defined in the agreement. You get a Schedule K, I believe it is called, which is attached to your personal tax return as a partner. And then those profits or losses then flow directly to your personal tax return. Taxation for artificial entities and corporations is treated differently, obviously, since the corporation is recognized as a legal entity separate, apart, and distinct from shareholders. States federal governments and local governments have been free then to levy income taxes on the profits of a corporation. And so corporations as a separate entity are required to file separate income tax returns, paying taxes on their income, generally at the federal, state, and local level. Now, that means profits are taxed at that level, at the corporate level. But they're also taxed, theoretically anyway, a second time, because those same profits, if they are going to be returned to the shareholders, are returned via dividends. And those dividends then are taxable and appear on the shareholders' individual tax returns. It's this idea of, and one of the quote-unquote disadvantages of doing business in the corporate form is this idea of double taxation. That is, the profits of a corporation are taxed once at the corporate level, and then they're taxed again as dividends when they are returned to shareholders. In theory, that's probably a disadvantage in practice today because of the lobbying efforts of the corporations in Congress. The impact, while it's still theoretically true, the impact of double taxation, at least on large corporations, is negligible, if non-existent. And the problem, I think, the last year that I am aware, we can judge from a corporation's financial statements, which are audited and deemed to be accurate and true within a reasonable degree, that those, we can tell for the year 2015 that the top 20 corporations in the United States that filed tax returns in the United States had, according to their audited financial statements, had over $200 billion in profit. They made $200 billion. The top 20 corporations, multinational, national corporations in the United States, had profits of $200+ billion. Hello, yeah, life is good, right? Yeah. Well, we can also tell by those same audited how much they paid in federal income tax. How much in federal income tax did those top 20 earners, most profitable corporations? How much did they pay on that $200 billion in profits? Did they actually pay in federal income tax during the year 2015? The number is zero, none, nada, zero. And that should not surprise us, I guess, that the wealth and influence and assets that these corporations have managed to acquire over the years has been put to use not only to grow bigger, but also to minimize absolutely and eliminate their tax burden. And so the taxation, double taxation concept does exist, however, among small and medium-sized organizations that don't get all the tax breaks that are in the tax code for large corporations. So that's still problematic. There have been, I think, maybe the last tax reform bill to go through, Trump's tax reform bill, tried to address some of that. I'm not sure it did. I have yet to really be able to look at that. But certainly this idea of double taxation as a drawback from doing business in the corporate form has been minimized. And in fact, the shareholders, I believe the maximum rate on dividends for shareholders for qualified dividends from U.S. corporations is 20%, and even then, I believe the first $2,000 or $3,000 of qualified dividends is exempt from taxation. So even shareholders are given a break. In the arena of taxation. Lastly, and maybe it is. Lastly, maybe it is not. Let me look real quick and see is which entity has an advantage in raising money. that's the corporation. And this, let's talk about that, is how businesses can raise money. Generally, if you're a sole proprietorship, you can either use your own assets or you can try to borrow money if you want to establish or expand a business operation. But your ability to raise money is limited by your credit worthiness as an individual, right? Yeah. Banks only loan sole proprietorships money based upon their individual credit worthiness. They have security and what their credit, and really they do want security, and what their credit ratings are, and past history, past dealings with the bank. And so sole proprietor's ability to raise capital is severely limited. It's limited by their credit rating. The same is true of partners and partnerships. Generally, you can bring a new partner in if they are able to contribute capital, so you can raise some money with that. You also do what? You dilute control of the other partners. You bring them in for a percentage of profits. And generally, sooner or later, the partnership's ability to raise capital is limited to the assets of the partners and their creditworthiness. However, shareholders of corporations, and corporation, let's talk about corporations can raise money in an additional way. They can borrow it. They have corporations generally are given the ability to borrow if the board of directors authorizes that. We call short-term borrowing be accounts payable. Long-term borrowing of corporations is done generally in the form of corporate bonds. That is, bonds are long-term promises to pay. Have various interest rates or obligations to pay, and they have, and it's a form of corporate debt. Now, what's the problem with debt, whether it be you borrow money from the bank as a sole proprietorship, a partnership, or a corporation? One of the problems is that one, you have to pay interest generally on that debt, and two, ultimately, the debt has to be paid back. No, yeah, we eventually have to pay the debt back at some point in time. Corporations, though, have an entirely different way, and this is one of the keys to understanding corporations and why they came to exist, is that they could do what? Sell equity, shares of stock. And so corporations, board of directors are very often are authorized to issue shares of stock. And so they do get to issue shares of stock. Now, what's the advantage of that? They issue and sell shares of stock. They get the cash. They issue the shares of stock. But generally, do they have to pay interest on that equity? No. And do shares of stock ever really have to be paid back? And the answer to that again is also no. They can be redeemed or backed by the corporation, but generally there's no obligation to do that. And so corporations have a real advantage in raising funds, because by selling equities, that shares of stock in their corporations, then they can raise funds that does not require payment of interest, nor does it ever really have to be paid back. Okay, so that's the entity then that has the advantage in raising money. It's corporations, but through the sale of equities. Okay, I think this kind of concludes this lecture. I just want to make sure I point out to you and you understand. We've just kind of given you a thumbnail sketch of the forms of business here with this lecture, that there are what I call hybrids, where the legislature has authorized artificial entities be created, limited partnerships, limited liability companies, and they're kind of hybrids. They have aspects of each one of the forms of business we just discussed here in a little bit different format, some of them. But again, one of the things you need to be aware of is that you can only do business in the forms authorized by statute, and those statutes must be strictly followed. And I did include in some of your reading some materials on LLCs and things of that nature. But again, those are the hybrids and kind of beyond the scope of this course a little bit as to a form of business to be able to conduct. I will again be on the air online on Tuesday at 6 p.m. Central Time. And I think we'll talk more about litigation in Buffalo Creek at that